am live. I'm reading out of Return to Elysium. It is another of Joan Grant's far memory books. It is her life as young Lucina, and this plays in Greece on an island, and it also plays in Rome. But we are now here in the third chapter, and Lucina has arrived in Elysium, or on Elysium, and she has met a few people, and we are now at chapter 3, which is entitled The Hero. While the weather was still warm, I did lessons in one of the garden pavilions, and I often found it difficult to learn, because my thoughts followed the thread spun by a curve of a sail, or a cloud, or soaring gulls against the sky. It was easier when the autumn chill drove us indoors. The frescoes made a pattern of stillness, like letters on a page. The steady glow of the charcoal brazier was no more exciting than the knowledge found in books. Praxiteles taught me to write. A plot or a misshapen letter really hurt him, so I often had to ask Epicurus to give me more papyrus. I used to tear up the spoiled sheets until I realized Epicurus disliked waste and expected me to keep them so that I could do lessons with him on the banks. I learned to read with Euripides, both in Greek and Latin. He considered Latin a vastly inferior language, but said it was necessary to be able to converse freely with people who were as yet too uncultured to appreciate our more subtle tongue. I wish the Romans had been more intelligent, so that they could have had the trouble of learning Greek. If I felt bored, I asked him to read me one of his favorite plays. Some I considered rather dull, until he let me act them. He used to make me say the same lines over and over again until I caught the right inflection and made the gestures look spontaneous. It was much more difficult than I expected to laugh or cry on purpose, to discover how to feel like the character I was supposed to represent. But it was well worth the trouble, for it proved very useful in getting my own way. Even Praxiteles ceased being tiresome about plots if I looked convincingly pathetic. Fortunately, he never guessed that I was only being Hecuba mourning the griefs of Ilium. Euripides let me wear the right clothes when I could remember my lines perfectly. Narcissus used to help me to dress up. I think he enjoyed it even more than I did. It was rather tiresome having to sit still for so long while he arranged my hair, for if I wriggled, he struck one of the pins into my scalp and then apologized without sincerity, and when he demanded formal curls, I had to sleep with my hair screwed up in wet rags. Both of them enjoyed acting female roles. Narcissus preferred being a goddess, but Euripides was usually a miserable old woman who wailed so effectively that the kohl ran off his eyelashes and made black streaks among the painted wrinkles. Sometimes they both looked very funny, but I never laughed unless they had been annoying. History with Agamemnon was the only lesson I really disliked. He wasted a lot of time telling me about strategy, which he illustrated with plans of battles, but only those our side had won. I felt there must have been other battles, or the foreigners would all have been killed long ago. I was supposed to remember dull lists of wars, which seemed to be caused by quarrels over something too trivial to be mentioned. I always pretended to understand the plans, for Agamemnon took so long to draw them that I could sit watching him and think about something else. He sometimes used to get really angry, and I had to spend hours making up for the time I had deliberately wasted. But this was before I knew about the spiders. I went to his room one day to tell him I was sorry I had missed our lesson, but that I had been talking to Aesculapius, so it was not my fault. He was lying on the bed, huddled down under the covers. I thought he was ill, until I saw he was staring at a spider which was lowering itself from the ceiling above his head. So Agamemnon didn't like spiders. He probably liked them even less than I liked history. Some people don't like spiders, And some are not very good at remembering the names of unimportant battles, I said briskly. I shall not mention spiders, unless you tell Arisculapius that I was being deliberately lazy. Then I climbed on the stool, caught the spider, and put it out of the window. For the next 2 months, Agamemnon even let me sleep during the lesson, if I felt inclined. When at last he lost his temper with me again, I pretended I had to go out of the room. When I came back, a spider, a large one with very hairy legs, fell out of a fold in my tunic. I had found it in the wood stack outside the kitchen. While I was looking for it, Epicurus saw me, so I had to pretend I was hungry and wanted a piece of bread. He gave me a thick slice with honey, and I had to eat it, hoping that the spider would not run down my leg and escape. It was very fortunate that Agamemnon was afraid of spiders instead of scorpions, for I did not like scorpions or snakes. If I thought at all about Agamemnon brandishing a sword on the stone plinth in the olive grove, I suppose I imagined he was only rehearsing the lines from a play. I had no idea that he was fighting a real enemy. He always seemed so excessively brave that I found it amusing to have found a secret chink in his armor. Whenever he was diving, I had to go off a higher rock than I enjoyed. Even when he climbed trees with me, I had to go further than was at all pleasant. He wrestled with such ferocity that I was glad Cleon had decided it was the only sport which I could not share, for even Praxiteles, who was taller and heavier than any of the others, had to exert himself to throw him. Arisculapius must have noticed that I often quarrelled with Agamemnon, for he gave me several hints to stop, and after I had been stupid enough to ignore them, he summoned me to his room. I had hoped, Lucina, that you might have been helpful to Agamemnon, but I perceive that your personal experience of the reality of fantasy has not increased your understanding. Therefore I must reluctantly inform you of certain facts, which I should have preferred him to tell you himself. For if the harmony of our community is to be preserved, it is no longer possible to wait for you to outgrow this childish desire to dominate your companions by playing on their fears. It is for you to decide whether knowledge of the circumstances will be sufficient to change your attitude, or whether I must find more stringent means. I had never seen Arisculapius look so stern. Did he mean that I was to be sent away from Elysium? I opened my mouth to plead with him, but he said coldly, "You will hear the story. We will discuss the implications afterwards." I listened, at first in bitter resentment and then with increasing shame. I thought you would tell Agamemnon how you were able to destroy the panic fear of the goat man by creating the opposite image of the daughter of the virgin moon. That you would have described it in your own words would have increased rather than diminished the force of the example. Remember, Lucina, that your object in Elysium is to learn to overcome fear, both in yourself and in others. When you deliberately increase a fear, you betray your integrity. He must have seen I was finding it difficult not to cry, for he continued in a milder voice, "Agamemnon, like yourself, has an unfortunate ability for creating subjective images, and then seeing them objectively. You see yourself as the conqueror, but he is open to every suggestion of defeat. You are of a naturally combative temperament. You will always attack rather than retreat, even when the most effective plan would be non-action. He has to be outwardly aggressive to conceal that his real tendency is to escape by abject flight from every challenge which he thinks will find him vulnerable. He is an only child, the son of a military hero, killed in the last phase of the war against the Persians, and a woman of dominant and destructive character who saw everyone in her environment as a source of personal aggrandizement. First she saw herself as the daughter of a famous man. He was an orator, but irrelevant to this narrative. Then as the wife of a hero. She found the role of widow inadequate, so she determined that her son should be the third means of making her influential. He must become a hero, so that she could be the mother of a hero. She nurtured the child on vastly exaggerated tales of his father's prowess, and made him practice the arts of war at an age when he should have been playing with other children. When he complained of pain, she upbraided him as a coward. When he failed to win in the games, she said he had dishonored his ancestors. When he fainted at the sight of his favorite dog killed by a chariot, she had all his animals slaughtered in front of him, to harden him against showing his feelings. The boy tried to become the hero she demanded. He made fantasies of himself leading an army to victory, of himself watching his friends killed while he remained invulnerable and disinterested. At 17, he experienced his first real battle, a frontier skirmish in which he sustained a minor wound, little more than a deep scratch in the arm. But she had forgotten that the theme of all her stories, the core of all his imagery, was the death of the hero. Death had been made the purpose of his living. The wound became infected by his terror of failure. When they brought him home, he was very close to death, to the death he coveted. I was asked to attend him, and thought I seldom accept patients the fee was too considerable to ignore. I was in delirium. He was in delirium, and by listening to his ravings, the source of his imminent dissolution became clear. I took considerable pleasure in telling the mother she had tried to kill her son, as certainly as though she had exposed him at birth. I called her a murderess and an incestuous harlot. I'm afraid I was not without resonance to her anger. He smiled. I think she might have been able to defend herself with the remnants of her pride had I not pulled aside a curtain and discovered the bier, what wreathed in the bays of the hero, already prepared for the dying boy, the bier beside which she expected to play the role of stoic mother who again had made the great sacrifice on the altar of Greece. She made no protest when I ordered my servants to carry the boy from the house and bring him here. That was nearly 2 years ago, but she has not asked for news of her living son, she who betrayed her only because he did not die too young. What did you do to stop him dying? He saw standing beside his bed a man wearing the bay-crowned helmet of the traditional hero. The man said his name was Agamemnon, and that the boy was to recover his health and bear the name in honor. He said that battle was only one of the many ways of dying, and that the hero was the man who learned to live. The boy no longer wanted to die, so his fever abated, and the clotted yellow poison of fear drained out of the wound, until the flesh was clean and could heal. Who was the man in the helmet? Was he real or only a dream? He was real enough, a friend of Cleon's, wearing a gold helmet which I borrowed from a friend who has a collection of antiquities in Athens. Does Agamemnon know he was tricked into getting well? Yes, perhaps he was told too soon. I hoped that the knowledge would complete his cure. But it didn't, or he would not still have to fight his enemies. Very few people, Lucina, have the courage to be themselves without being led by an ideal or driven by fear. If Agamemnon had been content to see himself as an ordinary soldier, he would have replaced that image by something equally valid, which was within the scope of his natural powers, for his mind is not of the quality from which outstanding personalities are developed. But Agamemnon cannot as yet accept a small role, though he knows it to be inevitable. Most of the time he is content to adjust himself to the niche which nature intended for him, and which will be suitable when he leaves here, the owner of a small, well-ordered property, content to identify himself with other men's triumphs as a spectator at the games or the theatre. But whenever he considers he has been vanquished by something trivial, such as a spider, especially a spider, which a girl can use as her ally, he seeks strength in the term of the original fantasy. He is inevitably defeated, being identified with one half of the personality against the other, instead of arbitrating in the conflict from the viewpoint of the integral self. Each defeat makes him more sensitive to ridicule, and therefore more determined to mock other people, more afraid and so more boastful, more terrified and so more desperate to act the bully in an attempt to prove his courage by a display of physical dominance. I ought to have recognized how he felt, I said humbly. How could anyone know better than I do what it feels like to boast because one is ashamed of being so terribly inadequate? He was suddenly the kind, gentle Asclepius again, so it was impossible not to be anguished because I had disappointed him. We grow through our failures into our success, he says. Remind me of that, Lucina, when I despair, because I cannot help Agamemnon. Remember it yourself, for you also will never be satisfied by bays already won. He patted me consolingly on the shoulder. But you will have bays, Lucina, and may they be earned with honor. I had to find some way of letting Agamemnon know I was sorry. But what could I do? I realized only too well that to tell him he knew he was afraid would make it more difficult. It would only make him hate me more. How could he do anything else if he thought I pitied him? The plan I decided on was silly, but curiously enough it worked much better than I hoped. I found a scorpion in my room and waited until I knew Agamemnon was outside the window. Then I began to scream, and when he came running to find what had happened, I clung around his neck and wept and said how terrified I was of scorpions. He was so kind to me that after he left I cried real tears for the Lucina who was often so unpleasant to discover in myself. For the Lucina who was often so unpleasant to discover in myself. So the next chapter is entitled Merchant's Scales.